Introduction to the Massacre, a tragic yet forgotten event in Jewish history. Throughout history, Jewish communities have faced waves of persecution, displacement, and violence. Some of these tragedies, like the Spanish Inquisition or the Holocaust, are well documented and widely acknowledged. Others, however, remain buried in the shadows of history, their victims forgotten, their stories untold. One such event is the Krakow Massacre of 1494, a brutal episode of anti-Jewish violence that decimated a thriving Jewish community in Poland. This massacre was not merely an instance of mob violence. It was a reflection of the deep-seated anti-Semitism that had taken root in European societies for centuries. It was also a pivotal moment that marked a shift in Poland's treatment of its Jewish population, setting the stage for centuries of fluctuating tolerance and persecution. Despite its significance, the Krakow Massacre is seldom mentioned in history books or public discourse. Unlike other well-known instances of Jewish suffering, this tragedy has been largely overlooked, hidden beneath the weight of later atrocities. Yet for those who perished and for the generations that followed, this event was life-altering. It reshaped the Jewish community of Krakow, altering its demographics, culture, and historical trajectory. The massacre not only left physical devastation, but also instilled a sense of fear and insecurity among Polish Jews who had once believed they had found a safe refuge. Today, as we stand here centuries later, it is our duty to bring this forgotten tragedy back into the light. We must remember the innocent lives lost, the pain endured, and the lessons that history teaches us about intolerance, scapegoating, and the consequences of unchecked hatred. The Krakow Massacre of 1494 deserves to be acknowledged, not just as a historical event, but as a somber reminder of the dangers of prejudice and the fragility of coexistence. Historical context: Krakow was considered a relative safe haven for Jews in Europe. To fully understand the impact of the Krakow Massacre of 1494, we must first look at the broader historical context of Jewish life in Poland during the late Middle Ages. At a time when Jewish communities across much of Europe faced relentless persecution, Poland was seen as one of the few places where Jews could live with a degree of stability and relative security. During the 13th and 14th centuries, as Jews were being expelled from England, 1290, France, 1306, and 1394, and parts of Germany and Spain, Poland emerged as a refuge. Polish rulers, particularly King Kazimierz III the Great, reigned 1333 to 1370, recognized the economic and cultural contributions of Jewish communities. In 1334, Kazimierz issued a royal charter granting Jews legal protections, allowing them to settle, trade, and practice their religion without fear of forced conversion or expulsion. This charter, reaffirmed by later monarchs, attracted waves of Jewish immigrants to Poland, including to its capital, Krakow, which became one of the most vibrant centers of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. By the late 15th century, Krakow had a well-established Jewish quarter near St. and Street, before it was moved to Kazimierz in the early 16th century. Jewish merchants, scholars, and artisans played a crucial role in the local economy, engaging in trade, banking, and craftsmanship. The city's Jewish community had built synagogues, schools, and cultural institutions, contributing to the intellectual and economic landscape of Poland. Unlike in Western Europe, where Jews were frequently accused of blood libel and subjected to violent pogroms, the Polish kings generally provided them with royal protection. However, this relative tolerance did not mean Jews were free from discrimination or resentment. Many members of the Catholic clergy and segments of the Polish population viewed Jews with suspicion, fueled by religious intolerance and economic envy. Tensions between Christians and Jews simmered beneath the surface, exacerbated by accusations that Jews were heretics or that their financial success came at the expense of Christian merchants and moneylenders. Additionally, the growing influence of the Catholic Church in Poland brought an increase in anti-Jewish rhetoric, making Jewish communities more vulnerable to hostility. By 1494, these tensions were reaching a boiling point. While Jews had found a measure of safety in Krakow for generations, the foundations of that security were beginning to crack. The widespread unrest, economic shifts, and religious divisions of late medieval Europe were creating a volatile environment where long-standing prejudices could easily ignite into violence. The Jewish community, despite its contributions to the city's prosperity, was still seen as an outsider group, one that could quickly become a scapegoat in times of crisis. Thus, when a fire broke out in Krakow in 1494, destroying parts of the city, it did not take long for blame to fall upon the Jewish population. The anger of the Christian majority, stoked by fear and deep-seated animosity, quickly turned into an uncontrollable wave of violence. What followed was one of the most devastating massacres of Jews in Polish history, a tragic event that shattered the illusion of Krakow as a safe haven and served as a grim reminder that Jewish security in medieval Europe was never guaranteed. Cause of the massacre, anti-Jewish riots were sparked by a fire in the city. The Krakow Massacre of 1494 did not occur in isolation, but was the culmination of growing tensions between the Jewish and Christian populations of the city. While anti-Jewish sentiment had been simmering beneath the surface for years, it was a catastrophic fire that ultimately served as the immediate catalyst for the violence that erupted. In the late 15th century, fires were a constant and devastating threat to medieval cities, where wooden buildings, thatched roofs, and open flames made urban centers highly vulnerable to widespread destruction. One such fire broke out in Krakow in 1494, spreading rapidly through the tightly packed streets and causing significant damage to homes, businesses, and places of worship. As was common in medieval Europe, whenever a disaster of this magnitude occurred, people searched for a cause, often looking for someone to blame rather than accepting it as an accident or an act of nature. Unfortunately, the Jewish community, already marginalized and subject to long-standing prejudices, became the scapegoat. Rumors began circulating that Jews had either intentionally set the fire or, at the very least, had somehow contributed to its spread. These accusations were completely unfounded, but they gained traction quickly, fueled by religious intolerance, economic competition, and a deep-seated belief that Jews were responsible for society's misfortunes. One of the reasons why Jews were often blamed for disasters like fires, plagues, and economic downturns was the prevalence of anti-Jewish conspiracy theories in medieval Christian society. The Catholic Church, through its sermons and teachings, had long promoted the idea that Jews were enemies of Christianity, accusing them of everything from ritual murder to poisoning wells. Such false allegations had led to violent pogroms across Europe, and Krakow was no exception. Beyond religious hostility, economic factors also played a role. By the late 15th century, Krakow had a thriving Jewish community engaged in trade, finance, and craftsmanship, fields that often put them in direct competition with Christian merchants and artisans. Some wealthier Jewish families even lent money to the nobility and the monarchy, leading to resentment among debtors. When the fire devastated the city, it provided a convenient opportunity for those who viewed Jewish economic success as a threat to unleash their frustrations in the form of violence. The authorities in Krakow, instead of protecting the Jewish population, allowed tensions to escalate. Whether due to incompetence, indifference, or even encouragement, local officials did little to quell the growing unrest. As mobs gathered and anger boiled over, what began as a whisper of suspicion quickly transformed into full-scale rioting. Enraged by rumors and eager for vengeance, Christian residents took to the streets, directing their fury toward the Jewish quarter. The fire of 1494 may have been an accident, but the massacre that followed was anything but. It was a deliberate act of violence rooted in centuries of prejudice and resentment. What should have been a tragedy that united the people of Krakow in rebuilding their city instead became an excuse for brutality, forever altering the course of the Jewish community in Poland. Scapegoating the Jewish community. Jews were falsely blamed for the fire. Scapegoating has long been a tool of oppression, used by societies throughout history to direct blame onto marginalized communities during times of crisis. The Krakow Massacre of 1494 was a brutal example of this phenomenon, where the Jewish population became the target of collective anger after a devastating fire swept through the city. Despite the lack of any evidence linking Jews to the disaster, they were swiftly and unjustly accused of causing the destruction. In medieval Europe, the idea of Jews as saboteurs or conspirators was deeply ingrained in the Christian imagination. The Catholic Church and various secular authorities had long promoted negative stereotypes about Jews, portraying them as enemies of Christendom. These harmful beliefs were reinforced through religious teachings, folklore, and discriminatory laws that cast Jews as perpetual outsiders within European society. Thus, when disasters such as plagues, droughts, or fires occurred, Jewish communities were often the first to be blamed. The fire that broke out in Krakow in 1494 was a calamity that destroyed large portions of the city, including homes, businesses, and places of worship. The destruction left many residents homeless and financially ruined, creating a climate of fear and desperation. Rather than searching for rational explanations, such as an accidental spark, an unattended hearth, or simple misfortune, many Christians in Krakow latched onto a more sinister theory, that the Jews had deliberately started the fire. Several factors made the Jewish community an easy target for blame. First, they were a distinct religious and cultural minority, visibly separate from the Christian majority in terms of their customs, language, and places of worship. Their economic success also made them the subject of envy and resentment. Jewish merchants, moneylenders, and artisans had carved out a place for themselves in Krakow's economy, which led some Christian competitors to view them as rivals. Accusing the Jews of arson provided a convenient pretext to justify attacking them, looting their businesses, and seizing their property. Another key factor was the influence of anti-Jewish rhetoric coming from certain factions of the clergy. Many Catholic priests in medieval Poland, as elsewhere in Europe, propagated the belief that Jews were not only spiritually dangerous, but also capable of committing heinous crimes against Christians. The concept of Jewish malice was widely accepted in some religious circles, making it easier for the general population to believe that the fire had been a deliberate act of destruction by the Jewish community. Furthermore, rumors and misinformation spread rapidly in medieval societies, where literacy rates were low and news was often conveyed through word of mouth. In the chaotic aftermath of the fire, accusations against the Jewish community took on a life of their own, fueled by fear, ignorance, and prejudice. People looking for someone to blame quickly turned their rage toward Jewish families, despite having no evidence to support their claims. As tensions escalated, the false accusations provided justification for what followed: the outbreak of violent riots, the destruction of the Jewish quarter, and the murder of innocent men, women, and children. The fire may have been a natural disaster, but the violence that followed was a man-made catastrophe, driven by deeply rooted societal divisions and the all-too-common practice of scapegoating minorities in times of crisis. Violence and destruction. Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues were burned. Once the Jewish community of Krakow was falsely blamed for the fire of 1494, the city erupted into a frenzy of violence. What began as rumors and accusations quickly escalated into one of the most devastating attacks against Jews in Polish history. The violence was not spontaneous. It was fueled by years of religious intolerance, economic resentment, and deep-seated anti-Semitism. The destruction that followed was brutal and widespread, leaving lasting scars on the Jewish population of Krakow. As the accusations against the Jews gained momentum, angry mobs, made up of townspeople, craftsmen, and other Christian residents, began gathering in the streets. Fueled by both righteous indignation and a desire for vengeance, they turned their fury toward the Jewish quarter, which at that time was located near Saint and Street before the community was forcibly relocated to Kazimierz decades later. The rioters, many of whom had likely suffered losses in the fire, saw the attack on the Jewish community as both an act of retribution and an opportunity for looting and destruction. With little to no resistance from city authorities, the mob launched an all-out assault on Jewish homes, businesses, and places of worship. Jewish houses were broken into, their doors and windows smashed, their interiors ransacked. Possessions were stolen, and anything deemed worthless was destroyed. Furniture, religious texts, and personal belongings were thrown into the streets or set on fire. The once thriving Jewish quarter was quickly reduced to smoldering ruins. Synagogues, the heart of Jewish spiritual and communal life, were not spared. These places of worship, which had stood as symbols of Jewish identity and faith, became prime targets for desecration. The rioters, driven by religious hatred, stormed into synagogues, vandalizing sacred objects, tearing apart Torah scrolls, and setting the buildings ablaze. The destruction of these holy sites was not just an act of physical violence, but also a calculated attempt to erase Jewish presence and identity in Krakow. The mob's fury extended beyond property destruction. Jewish men, women, and children were attacked in the streets and within their homes. Countless lives were lost as rioters showed no mercy in their assaults. Some victims were beaten to death, while others were burned alive in the very buildings they had once called home. Those who managed to escape the immediate violence faced a grim fate. Many were forcibly expelled from the city, stripped of their belongings, and left to wander as exiles. For those who survived, the massacre was not just a personal loss, but the end of a thriving community as they knew it. Families were torn apart. Businesses that had taken generations to build were gone overnight, and the sense of security that Krakow's Jews had once felt was shattered beyond repair. Even those who remained in the city would never again experience the same level of stability. Despite the scale of destruction, the perpetrators of these crimes faced little to no punishment. The authorities, whether out of sympathy for the rioters, fear of further unrest, or outright anti-Semitism, largely turned a blind eye to the devastation. In many ways, this lack of justice signaled to future generations that violence against Jews could be carried out without consequence, a dangerous precedent that would have echoes in later centuries of European history. The Krakow Massacre of 1494 was not just a violent outburst. It was an event that permanently altered the trajectory of Jewish life in Poland. What had once been a relatively safe haven for Jewish communities now became a place of fear and instability. The physical destruction of Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues was a manifestation of something far deeper. The ongoing struggle of Jewish people to exist in a world that repeatedly sought to erase them. Mass killings and expulsions. Many Jews were killed, and survivors were forced into exile. The Krakow Massacre of 1494 was not just an episode of looting and destruction. It was an event marked by horrific violence, mass killings, and the forced removal of the city's Jewish population. As the chaos spread, the rioters did not limit themselves to burning Jewish homes and synagogues. They turned their rage onto the Jewish people themselves. What followed was a merciless slaughter, with Jewish men, women, and children brutally murdered in the streets, in their homes, and in places of worship. The scale of the killings was immense. Entire families were wiped out, trapped inside their burning homes, or cut down by the swords and clubs of the rioters. There are accounts of Jewish individuals trying to flee, only to be caught and murdered by the mob. Some sought refuge in synagogues, hoping that the sanctity of their places of worship would protect them, but these buildings were also set ablaze. Those who remained inside either perished in the flames or were dragged out and killed. For the Jewish community, this was not just an attack, it was a deliberate campaign of terror and extermination. The rioters, fueled by a mix of religious hatred, economic envy, and bloodlust, showed no mercy. Jewish children were torn from their parents, many slaughtered before their families' eyes. Elderly members of the community, too frail to escape, were among the first to perish. Women were subjected to unspeakable violence before being killed. Beyond the massacre itself, the survivors faced an equally grim fate. In the aftermath of the attack, many of the remaining Jews were forcibly expelled from Krakow. The very city that had once promised them refuge and economic opportunity now cast them out, treating them as scapegoats rather than victims. They were stripped of their homes, businesses, and livelihoods, forced to leave behind everything they had built. With nowhere to go and little to their names, many wandered to surrounding villages or sought shelter in other parts of Poland, particularly in Kazimierz, a district outside Krakow that would later become the center of Jewish life. Expulsion was a fate nearly as cruel as death. The roads leading away from Krakow were lined with desperate Jewish families, carrying whatever few possessions they could salvage. Some fell victim to bandits, while others succumbed to hunger, exposure, or disease. They were refugees in their own country, abandoned by the authorities who should have protected them. Even those who managed to remain in Krakow did so under severely restricted conditions. Many Jewish survivors were barred from returning to their former homes and businesses. Instead, they were forced to relocate to Kazimierz, which at the time was a separate town. This segregation marked a turning point in Jewish life in Poland, establishing a pattern of enforced separation that would persist for centuries. The Krakow Massacre of 1494 was not just a moment of loss. It was an event that reshaped the Jewish presence in Poland. It sent a clear message that Jews, no matter how long they had lived in a city, no matter how much they had contributed to its economy and culture, could be turned into targets of mass violence and forced displacement at any moment. It was a tragedy that foreshadowed the many expulsions and massacres that would follow in Poland and across Europe. A dark reminder that Jewish communities were always at risk, no matter how secure they seemed. The role of the authorities, indifference, complicity, and failure to protect the Jewish community. The Krakow Massacre of 1494 was not simply the result of an uncontrolled mob acting out of spontaneous rage. It was allowed to happen due to the indifference, complicity, and failures of the city's authorities. In medieval Poland, Jewish communities were often under the direct protection of the monarchy or local rulers, who saw them as valuable contributors to the economy. However, this protection was often conditional, easily withdrawn when political pressure, economic motives, or religious influences demanded otherwise. When the fire of 1494 devastated Krakow, it created a climate of fear and instability. Instead of responding with reason and law, the city's authorities allowed emotions to dictate events. The ruling elites, who had the power to prevent or at least limit the violence, stood by as anti-Jewish sentiments boiled over into full-scale massacre. Their failure to intervene not only cost hundreds of Jewish lives, but also set a dangerous precedent that Jews in Krakow, despite their legal rights, could be violently persecuted without consequence. Deliberate inaction and indifference. One of the most striking aspects of the Krakow Massacre was the lack of immediate intervention by city officials, the royal court, or law enforcement. As riots erupted and Jewish homes were set ablaze, there was no organized effort to control the crowds or protect innocent civilians. In fact, there is evidence to suggest that many within the governing class sympathized with the rioters or saw an opportunity to benefit from the violence. Jewish communities in medieval Poland were often under royal charters, which granted them certain protections in exchange for economic contributions, such as taxes and loans. However, these protections were only as strong as the willingness of local authorities to uphold them. When the mobs turned against the Jews, those in power did nothing to stop the bloodshed, revealing the fragile nature of these so-called privileges. The silence of Krakow's leadership was itself a form of complicity. The influence of the Catholic Church and religious leaders. The Catholic Church played a powerful role in shaping public attitudes toward Jews, and in the case of Krakow, it is likely that certain clergy members fueled anti-Jewish sentiments rather than condemning the violence. By the late 15th century, religious hostility toward Jews was deeply ingrained in Polish society, with many sermons portraying them as enemies of Christianity. These teachings contributed to the widespread belief that Jews were guilty of crimes such as blasphemy, heresy, and even harming Christians through sorcery or conspiracy. Rather than calling for calm, Some religious figures may have used the fire as an opportunity to demonize the Jewish community further, strengthening the perception that Jews were a dangerous and subversive presence in Krakow. This religiously motivated anti-Semitism did not just allow the massacre to happen. It justified it in the eyes of many Christians, making it easier for ordinary townspeople to participate in or tolerate the violence. Economic and political motives behind the lack of protection. While religious hostility played a role, economic and political considerations also influenced the authorities in action. By the late 15th century, Jewish merchants, bankers, and artisans had become integral to Krakow's economy. However, their success led to resentment among Christian competitors, particularly in the growing middle class. Many Christian merchants saw the massacre as an opportunity to eliminate Jewish competition and take over their businesses and assets. There is strong evidence to suggest that some nobles and city officials personally benefited from the massacre. Wealthy Jewish families often loaned money to the monarchy and local aristocrats. By allowing the massacre and expulsion to happen, debtors could conveniently erase their financial obligations, freeing themselves from repayment. In this way, the failure of authorities to act was not simply a matter of negligence, but a calculated decision that served the interests of those in power. Long-term consequences of government complicity. The massacre of 1494 permanently changed the Jewish presence in Krakow. While some survivors fled to the nearby district of Kazimierz, their forced relocation marked the beginning of Jewish segregation in the city, a policy that would later become common across Poland. This event also sent a clear message to the Jewish population. Their protection under the law was conditional, and their lives and property could be destroyed at any moment. The failure of Krakow's authorities to intervene effectively set a precedent for future violence against Jews in Poland. Over the following centuries, similar massacres and expulsions would take place across Eastern Europe, often under the same circumstances. Officials either turned a blind eye to the suffering of Jewish communities or actively encouraged their persecution. The Krakow Massacre of 1494 was not just an isolated tragedy. It was a warning sign of how easily anti-Semitic violence could unfold when those in power either failed to act or chose to benefit from the suffering of others. Forced relocation. The surviving Jews were expelled to Kazimierz, creating a segregated Jewish quarter. The aftermath of the Krakow Massacre of 1494 did not mark the end of suffering for the Jewish community. Instead, it introduced a new chapter of oppression and forced segregation. While many Jews were murdered during the riots, those who survived faced another devastating blow. They were forcibly expelled from Krakow and relocated to the nearby town of Kazimierz. This expulsion not only uprooted an entire population from their homes, but also set a precedent for the legal and social isolation of Jews in Poland for centuries to come. The expulsion from Krakow. Before the massacre, Krakow's Jewish community had lived and thrived within the city, conducting trade, running businesses, and contributing to the economy. However, following the violence of 1494, the authorities decided that Jews would no longer be permitted to reside in the city proper. Under orders from King John I Albert, the surviving Jewish families were forced to leave their homes, shops, and synagogues behind, with little more than what they could carry. The expulsion was not merely a logistical decision. It was a deliberate attempt to physically separate Jews from the Christian population. The authorities justified this move by claiming it would prevent further tensions between the two communities, but in reality, it was an act of legalized discrimination and exclusion. By confining Jews to a specific area outside the city walls, the government could more easily regulate and control their movements, economic activity, and legal rights. The establishment of the Jewish quarter in Kazimierz. The expelled Jews were relocated to Kazimierz, a separate town located just outside Krakow. Though initially independent, Kazimierz would later become part of Krakow, and it would remain the center of Jewish life in the region for centuries. The establishment of this segregated Jewish quarter marked a major shift in Jewish history in Poland, as it set a precedent for Jewish ghettos in other cities across Eastern Europe. At first, the Jewish community struggled to rebuild their lives in Kazimierz. Many had lost all their possessions, homes, and businesses in the massacre, and they arrived in their new settlement with almost nothing. However, despite these hardships, the Jews of Kazimierz worked to establish new homes, markets, and places of worship. Over time, the area developed into a thriving Jewish cultural and religious hub, home to synagogues, schools, and businesses that would define Jewish life in Krakow for generations. Segregation, surveillance, and restrictions. Although Kazimierz eventually became a center of Jewish culture, its initial establishment was rooted in segregation and control. The forced relocation of Krakow's Jews to this district was not a gesture of goodwill or a solution to social tensions. It was a means of isolating and regulating a population that had been unjustly blamed for the city's misfortunes. Once confined to Kazimierz, Jews faced strict limitations on where they could live, work, and trade. They were often forced to pay additional taxes and were denied the same rights as Christian citizens. Laws restricted their ability to own land, build new homes, and engage in certain professions, ensuring that they remained economically and socially disadvantaged. Furthermore, the physical separation of Jews from the Christian population reinforced negative stereotypes and prejudices. Over time, Kazimierz became associated with otherness, and its residents were viewed as outsiders, even though Jews had been part of Krakow's society for centuries before the expulsion. The quarter became a place where Jews could be easily monitored, controlled, and persecuted if tensions arose again in the future, a model for future Jewish ghettos. The forced relocation to Kazimierz was one of the earliest examples of Jewish ghettoization in Eastern Europe. It set a precedent that would later be replicated in cities across Poland, Germany, and beyond. The idea that Jews should live in separate, confined quarters away from the Christian population became a widely accepted policy, eventually leading to the creation of formal Jewish ghettos in cities like Warsaw, Prague, and Venice. In many ways, Kazimierz was a prototype for later Jewish ghettos, a space that, while culturally rich and vibrant, was also a symbol of exclusion, restriction, and state-enforced separation. This pattern of removing Jews from city centers and confining them to specific districts continued for centuries, culminating in some of the most infamous episodes of Jewish history, including the establishment of Nazi-era ghettos in the 20th century. The psychological and social impact of forced relocation. Beyond the immediate economic and legal consequences, the expulsion of Krakow's Jews to Kazimierz had a profound psychological impact on the community. For many, the massacre and subsequent relocation shattered their sense of security and belonging. The Jews of Krakow had lived among Christians for generations, contributing to the city's growth and prosperity. Being forcibly removed from their homes sent a clear message that they were not truly considered part of the society they had helped build. The relocation also disrupted family networks, communal structures, and religious life. Many Jews who had once lived near their businesses or synagogues were now forced to start over in an unfamiliar area with limited resources. The trauma of the massacre, combined with the humiliation of forced exile, left deep scars on the Jewish population, shaping their collective memory and reinforcing a sense of vulnerability that would persist for generations. A community that refused to disappear. Despite the hardship, the Jewish community of Kazimierz endured and thrived. Over time, the quarter became a center of Jewish scholarship, trade, and culture. It produced great rabbis, religious thinkers, and merchants who left a lasting impact on Jewish history. However, the forced relocation of 1494 remained a symbol of injustice, a reminder that Jewish communities could be uprooted and displaced at the whims of rulers and the prejudices of the majority population. The economic impact. Jewish businesses were destroyed and the city's economy suffered. The Krakow Massacre of 1494 was not just a humanitarian and cultural disaster. It was also an economic catastrophe for both the Jewish community and the city of Krakow itself. For centuries, Jews have played a crucial role in Krakow's economy, serving as merchants, moneylenders, craftsmen, and traders. Their forced expulsion and the destruction of their businesses created an economic void that impacted not only the Jewish survivors, but also the broader urban economy. Jewish economic contributions before the massacre. Before the tragedy, Krakow's Jewish community had been deeply embedded in the city's economic structure. Jewish merchants were responsible for a significant portion of local and international trade, particularly in goods like textiles, furs, spices, and precious metals. Jewish moneylenders provided financial services that were often unavailable through Christian institutions due to religious restrictions on lending at interest. Jewish artisans and craftsmen contributed to the local economy by producing high-quality goods and employing workers. By the late 15th century, Krakow was a prosperous trade hub, benefiting from its location on key commercial routes between Western and Eastern Europe. Jewish entrepreneurs were a driving force behind this economic success, connecting Krakow to trade networks in Bohemia, Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and beyond. Many Christian nobles and merchants depended on Jewish financiers for loans and investments, and the city's overall prosperity was closely tied to the contributions of Jewish economic activity. The destruction of Jewish businesses. When a massacre erupted in 1494, Jewish businesses were among the first targets of the rioters. Mobs looted and burned Jewish shops, markets, and warehouses, destroying decades' worth of hard work and economic investment. Jewish-owned stalls in Krakow's bustling marketplaces were ransacked, with goods either stolen or set on fire. Shops that had once thrived with commerce were reduced to ashes, leaving Jewish merchants bankrupt and without a means to rebuild. This destruction was not just an act of blind rage. It also had economic motives. Many of the rioters were Christian craftsmen and merchants who saw Jewish competitors as a threat. By attacking and eliminating Jewish businesses, they sought to remove economic competition and gain control over the market. Christian guilds, which had long resented Jewish artisans and traders, saw the massacre as an opportunity to monopolize local industries without Jewish competitors. For Jewish business owners, the devastation was total. Not only had they lost their homes, but they also lost their entire livelihoods. The tools, goods, and financial records that had sustained their businesses were gone. The destruction of Jewish banks and money-lending institutions meant that loans could no longer be repaid or collected, disrupting financial relationships between Jews and Christian clients. Many Jewish workers and artisans became destitute overnight, forced into exile without any resources to rebuild their lives. How Krakow's economy suffered after the massacre. While many Christian merchants and craftsmen initially benefited from the elimination of Jewish competition, the long-term effects of the massacre were detrimental to Krakow's economy as a whole. The expulsion of Jews from the city and the destruction of their businesses led to financial instability and economic stagnation in the years that followed. One immediate consequence was the disruption of trade networks. Jewish merchants had served as essential intermediaries in commerce between Poland, Germany, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. With their removal, Krakow lost valuable connections to foreign markets, leading to declines in trade volume and economic growth. Many trade agreements that had once benefited Krakow collapsed, as Jewish merchants who had facilitated these exchanges were no longer present. The destruction of Jewish banks and financial institutions also led to credit shortages. Christian nobles, merchants, and city officials who had previously relied on Jewish moneylenders now found themselves without access to loans, which limited their ability to fund new business ventures, expand trade, or invest in infrastructure. With fewer financial resources available, the city's economic expansion slowed significantly. Additionally, many Jewish artisans and skilled workers had been crucial to Krakow's manufacturing industries, particularly in textiles, leatherworking, and metalwork. Their forced removal created labor shortages, leading to higher prices for goods and a decline in overall productivity. The guilds that had sought to remove Jewish competition soon found that the absence of Jewish workers reduced the overall output of Krakow's economy. making it harder for the city to compete with other commercial centers in Europe. The long-term economic consequences of the massacre. The economic damage caused by the 1494 massacre and expulsion was not temporary. It had long-term effects that shaped Krakow's economy for decades. The forced relocation of Jews to Kazimierz meant that Krakow lost a significant portion of its wealth-generating population, as Jewish merchants and bankers had historically played a key role in the city's prosperity. Over time, Kazimierz developed into a major Jewish economic center. But because it was separate from Krakow proper, the city itself did not benefit as directly from Jewish commerce as it had before the massacre. Instead, Kazimierz's economy grew in parallel to Krakow's, with Jews developing their own self-sufficient commercial networks rather than reintegrating into the broader city economy. Furthermore, the pattern of exclusion and forced relocation established by the massacre set a dangerous precedent for the future. In later centuries, Krakow's authorities continued to impose restrictions on Jewish economic activity, limiting Jewish access to certain industries and preventing them from freely participating in the broader economy. These restrictions weakened Krakow's ability to compete with other emerging commercial centers in Poland and Europe. The massacre also had a lasting impact on Christian economic attitudes toward Jews. While the 1494 riots had originally been driven by resentment and fear, over time, many Christian merchants and nobles realized that Jewish financial and commercial expertise had been crucial to Krakow's economic success. This led to cycles of expulsion and readmission, where Jewish merchants were invited back into cities only when their economic contributions were needed, a pattern that would repeat in other Polish cities in the following centuries. A tragedy that hurt both Jews and Krakow itself. The economic consequences of the 1494 Krakow massacre illustrate a broader truth about historical anti-Semitic violence. It often backfired on the very societies that carried it out. While Christian rioters may have sought to eliminate Jewish competition and take over their businesses, the reality was that Jewish contributions to commerce, finance, and industry were indispensable to Krakow's prosperity. By destroying Jewish businesses and expelling Jewish residents, Krakow's leaders not only inflicted immense suffering on the Jewish community, but also undermined their own economy, leading to long-term financial decline and stagnation. Cultural and religious devastation, the destruction of synagogues, books, and centuries of Jewish learning. The Krakow massacre of 1494 was not just an attack on Jewish lives and businesses. It was also a direct assault on Jewish culture, religious identity, and intellectual heritage. Throughout history, violence against Jewish communities has often been accompanied by the deliberate destruction of synagogues, sacred texts, and centers of learning, as oppressors sought to erase Jewish traditions and undermine their communal structures. The events of 1494 were no exception. When a massacre erupted, the Jewish quarter of Krakow became a target for widespread arson and looting. Synagogues, houses of study, and personal libraries were set ablaze, destroying religious artifacts, Torah scrolls, and invaluable manuscripts that had been carefully preserved for generations. The loss of these sacred institutions represented not only a material destruction, but also a spiritual and intellectual wound that profoundly affected the Jewish community. The burning of synagogues, an attack on Jewish spiritual life. For medieval Jewish communities, the synagogue was far more than just a place of worship. It was the heart of religious, social, and educational life. It served as a center for prayer, communal gatherings, and learning, where Jewish scholars, rabbis, and students studied religious texts and debated interpretations of Jewish law. The destruction of Krakow's synagogues in 1494 was, therefore, not just an attack on buildings, but an assault on Jewish faith and identity. Eyewitness accounts suggest that as the mob set fire to Jewish homes and businesses, they also targeted places of worship. Torah scrolls, handwritten parchments containing the sacred texts of Judaism, were torn from their arks, trampled upon, and thrown into the flames. Religious artifacts, prayer books, and ceremonial objects were looted or destroyed. To Jews, The burning of a Torah scroll was considered an act of the highest desecration, equivalent to an attack on the very soul of their faith. The destruction of synagogues had a devastating psychological effect on the Jewish survivors. These sacred spaces have been central to their community for generations, and their loss left many feeling abandoned, both by society and by divine protection. Without synagogues, Jewish religious life was severely disrupted, and the survivors who were forced into exile in Kazimierz had to begin the difficult process of rebuilding from nothing. The loss of Jewish scholarship and intellectual heritage. Krakow was home to a thriving Jewish scholarly community before the massacre. Jewish scholars in the city had been writing, copying, and preserving texts on Jewish law, philosophy, ethics, and science, many of which were unique works reflecting centuries of Jewish intellectual development. However, much of this knowledge was lost in the fires of 1494. The destruction of private and communal libraries was one of the greatest cultural tragedies of the massacre. Jewish scholars kept extensive collections of religious and secular works, including Talmudic commentaries, writings that interpreted Jewish law and traditions, often containing debates between scholars across different generations. Halakhic texts, legal works that guided Jewish daily life, governing everything from dietary laws to civil disputes. Philosophical and scientific manuscripts. Many Jewish scholars in Krakow were influenced by Muslim and Christian philosophers, incorporating broader intellectual traditions into their studies. These manuscripts reflected the Jewish engagement with fields such as medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. Personal religious writings. Many Jewish families kept handwritten notes, prayer books, and ethical wills that passed down traditions and moral teachings through generations. As the flames consumed these books, centuries of Jewish knowledge, wisdom, and history were erased in a matter of hours. The loss of these texts was irreversible, severing the connection between past generations of scholars and future Jewish intellectuals who would never have access to these works. Why the destruction of Jewish books was so significant. For medieval Jews, books were more than just objects. They were sacred vessels of knowledge, essential to the survival of their religious and cultural identity. Unlike Christian communities, where religious knowledge was often centralized within the clergy, Jewish communities relied on widespread literacy and scholarship among their members. The ability to study, interpret, and debate religious texts was a core part of Jewish life, and access to books was seen as fundamental to communal survival. The deliberate destruction of Jewish books in 1494 was part of a broader pattern of anti-Semitic violence throughout Europe, where the burning of Jewish texts was often used as a method of persecution. In previous centuries, similar incidents had occurred. In 1242, thousands of Talmudic manuscripts were burned in Paris, ordered by King Louis IX. In 1391, Jewish libraries were destroyed during anti-Jewish riots in Spain as part of the forced conversions leading up to the Spanish Inquisition. In 1492, following the expulsion of Jews from Spain, many Jewish texts were confiscated or destroyed to prevent Jewish communities from preserving their traditions. The events in Krakow in 1494 were part of this tragic history of book burnings as a form of oppression. By erasing Jewish texts, oppressors sought to weaken Jewish resilience, knowing that their cultural and religious strength was deeply tied to the written word. The impact on Jewish education and future generations. Beyond the immediate loss of books and synagogues, the massacre and its destruction of religious institutions had long-term consequences for Jewish education in Krakow. Before 1494, the Jewish community had established schools and centers of learning where young students could be trained in Hebrew, religious law, and secular knowledge. The destruction of these institutions forced Jewish educators and students to start over, often with limited resources. In the years that followed, Kazimierz became a new center of Jewish scholarship, as rabbis and teachers worked to rebuild their lost institutions. However, this process took generations, and much of the lost knowledge from pre-massacre Krakow could never be fully recovered. The community had to recreate their schools, rewrite their texts, and reclaim their traditions from the ashes of destruction. The trauma of 1494 shaped how Jewish communities in Poland approached education and religious preservation. Understanding that their texts and synagogues could be destroyed at any time, future generations of Polish Jews placed even greater emphasis on copying and distributing texts widely, ensuring that knowledge could be preserved across multiple locations. The memory of the massacre reinforced the importance of intellectual resilience, teaching Jewish communities to be vigilant in protecting their cultural and religious heritage. A devastation beyond physical destruction. The cultural and religious devastation of the 1494 massacre was as profound as the loss of life itself. When synagogues burned, so too did the heart of Jewish communal life. When books were destroyed, so too was the bridge between past and future generations. The massacre did not just remove Jews from Krakow streets. It sought to erase their presence, their faith, and their history. Even as the survivors fled to Kazimierz, they carried with them the pain of loss and the determination to rebuild. While physical structures could be reconstructed, the knowledge and cultural heritage that had been lost in the flames could never be fully restored, making the Krakow Massacre of 1494 one of the most tragic episodes in Jewish intellectual history. The psychological trauma. The massacre created a deep sense of fear and insecurity among Polish Jews. The Krakow Massacre of 1494 was not only a physical and economic catastrophe for the Jewish community, it was also a profound psychological and emotional tragedy. The events of that year left deep scars on the collective Jewish consciousness, instilling a pervasive sense of fear, insecurity, and vulnerability that would last for generations. Jewish communities across Poland had long been aware of the dangers of anti-Semitic violence, but the scale and brutality of the 1494 massacre shattered any illusions of stability and safety in Krakow. The massacre served as a grim reminder that Jews, no matter how integrated they were into a city's economy or society, could be targeted, attacked, and expelled at any moment, often with the approval or indifference of the ruling authorities. The immediate psychological impact on survivors. For those who witnessed the horrors of the massacre firsthand, the psychological effects were immediate and devastating. Families were torn apart, loved ones were murdered, and homes were burned to the ground. Many survivors had lost everything, their businesses, their possessions, and their sense of security. The sheer brutality of the attacks, with mobs rampaging through Jewish neighborhoods, looting, killing, and destroying, created a deep and lasting trauma for those who lived through it. Many survivors suffered from grief and shock, unable to process the sudden loss of family members, friends, and community leaders. Those who had escaped death but lost their homes and businesses were left in despair and uncertainty, wondering how they would rebuild their lives in a new place. Parents had to explain to their children why their homes were gone, why their synagogues had been burned, and why they were no longer welcome in the city they had called home. Jewish leaders, including rabbis and scholars, had to reassure their communities while struggling with their own sense of helplessness in the face of such brutality. For many, the trauma of the massacre led to psychological distress, including what modern scholars might recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Some survivors may have suffered from nightmares, anxiety, and depression, reliving the terror of the attacks in their minds long after the violence had ended. Others may have developed a sense of paranoia and hypervigilance, constantly fearing that another massacre could happen at any moment. The long-term emotional toll on the Jewish community. Beyond the immediate survivors, the massacre also had a long-term emotional impact on the broader Jewish community, both in Krakow and in other parts of Poland. The story of the massacre was passed down through oral tradition and written accounts, becoming part of Jewish historical memory. Even Jews who had not lived through the events themselves felt the weight of the tragedy, as they grew up hearing stories of the violence, the destruction, and the suffering endured by their ancestors. This intergenerational trauma shaped Jewish attitudes toward non-Jewish society, reinforcing the idea that Jews could never afford to let their guard down. The massacre taught Krakow's Jewish community a painful lesson. Even in times of relative peace and prosperity, danger was never far away. Many Jews became more cautious about where they lived and how they conducted their businesses, fearing that success or visibility might make them targets of resentment and violence. Jewish families taught their children to be wary of outsiders, warning them of the dangers of anti-Semitic mobs and unpredictable rulers. The sense of insecurity led to stronger communal bonds, as Jews relied on each other for protection, support, and survival. Jewish leaders placed greater emphasis on preserving records of the massacre, ensuring that future generations would never forget the atrocities committed against their people. The psychological impact of forced relocation to Kazimierz. For the Jews who were forcibly expelled from Krakow and relocated to Kazimierz, the trauma of displacement added another layer of emotional suffering. Being driven out of their homes and placed in a separate quarter reinforced the idea that they were outsiders, unwelcome in the broader society. The forced relocation was not just a physical move. It was a symbolic act of exclusion, a reminder that Jews were considered second-class citizens, tolerated but not truly accepted. The new Jewish quarter in Kazimierz eventually became a thriving center of Jewish culture, but in the years immediately following the massacre, it was a place of mourning, loss, and uncertainty. The survivors of the massacre had to rebuild their community from scratch, all while grappling with the psychological scars of what they had endured. Many Jews felt a deep sense of humiliation at having been expelled from Krakow, forced to leave behind the homes and businesses they had worked so hard to establish. The trauma of the massacre made many Jews fearful of future expulsions and attacks, leading to a sense of perpetual instability. The loss of sacred spaces, such as synagogues and study halls, made it difficult for many to feel spiritually connected, adding to their emotional distress. A culture of fear and preparedness. In the centuries that followed, the memory of the 1494 massacre continued to shape the way Jews in Poland and beyond viewed their place in society. The psychological trauma of the event created a culture of vigilance and preparedness, as Jews learned that they could never take their safety for granted. Jewish communities began to develop stronger self-defense measures, including establishing networks of communication with Jewish communities in other cities to share warnings and prepare for potential attacks. The trauma of the massacre led some Jews to become more politically cautious, avoiding actions that might attract unwanted attention from authorities or the broader Christian population. Jewish leaders emphasized the importance of community solidarity, encouraging Jews to support one another financially, emotionally, and spiritually in times of crisis. Many Jewish families became experts at mobility, always prepared to pack up and leave if another wave of violence forced them to flee. This culture of fear and preparedness was not unique to Krakow's Jews. Similar patterns emerged in Jewish communities throughout Europe, where pogroms, expulsions, and massacres were tragically common. The Krakow Massacre of 1494 reinforced the idea that Jewish survival depended on resilience, adaptability, and a deep awareness of the ever-present threat of persecution. The psychological legacy of the massacre in Jewish history. The psychological wounds left by the 1494 massacre did not fade with time. Instead, they became part of the larger historical trauma of the Jewish people, adding to a long list of persecutions, expulsions, and massacres that had shaped Jewish identity over centuries. The memory of what had happened in Krakow was passed down through generations, influencing how Jews viewed the world and their place within it. For many, the massacre became a symbol of the precariousness of Jewish existence, a reminder that no matter how successful or integrated Jews might become in a society, they could still be targeted at any moment. This painful awareness of historical vulnerability would later influence Jewish migration patterns, religious teachings, and even political movements in the centuries to come. Even today, when historians and Jewish scholars study the psychological effects of anti-Semitic violence, the Krakow Massacre of 1494 remains a powerful example of how persecution can leave deep emotional scars that endure long after the physical destruction has ended. The fear, trauma, and resilience that emerged from this tragedy continue to echo through Jewish history, shaping the way Jewish communities remember the past and prepare for the future. The historical silence. Why the Krakow Massacre of 1494 remains a forgotten chapter in Jewish and European history. Despite its brutality, the Krakow Massacre of 1494 remains largely unknown outside of academic and Jewish historical circles. Unlike other well-documented episodes of anti-Semitic violence, such as the Spanish Inquisition, the pogroms of Eastern Europe, or the Holocaust, the tragic events of 1494 have been overlooked and forgotten by much of mainstream history. This historical silence raises important questions. Why has this massacre not received the attention it deserves? What factors have contributed to its erasure from collective memory? How has this silence affected the way we understand Jewish history and European medieval history? The lack of widespread knowledge about this tragedy is not merely an accident of history. It is the result of a complex interplay of political, social, and historiographical factors that have contributed to its marginalization. The lack of contemporary documentation and chronicles. One of the biggest challenges in remembering the Krakow Massacre of 1494 is the scarcity of contemporary historical records. Many events of the medieval and early modern period were documented through royal decrees, official records, and the writings of prominent chroniclers. However, the massacre of Krakow's Jews was not widely recorded in non-Jewish sources, which has contributed to its historical obscurity. Unlike other major massacres, there are few surviving Christian or royal records that provide detailed accounts of what happened. Many official sources prioritized the interests of the ruling elite and did not see the destruction of the Jewish quarter as historically significant. Jewish sources, while valuable, were often destroyed or lost over time, especially in later centuries when Jewish communities faced further persecutions, wars, and upheavals. The lack of widespread literacy among the general population at the time meant that only a limited number of personal accounts survived, reducing the number of first-hand testimonies available to later historians. Unlike events such as the Spanish expulsion of 1492, which was meticulously documented by both Christian and Jewish sources, the Krakow Massacre did not generate the same level of written historical discourse, making it more vulnerable to being forgotten over time. Political and religious narratives that erased Jewish suffering. Another reason for the historical silence surrounding the Krakow Massacre is the way European historiography has traditionally framed medieval and early modern events. In many cases, histories written by Christian scholars and European institutions have minimized or ignored Jewish suffering, focusing instead on political, military, or religious developments that were seen as more central to European history. The expulsions and massacres of Jews were often recorded only as footnotes in broader narratives of royal rule, economic policy, or religious reform. In many European countries, including Poland, the historical treatment of Jews was often shaped by nationalist or Catholic perspectives, which did not prioritize documenting Jewish tragedies. Jewish persecution was sometimes framed as a natural or inevitable part of medieval life, leading historians to overlook the personal and communal suffering of Jewish victims. Some historical narratives focused on the idea that Jews were protected by Polish rulers, which led to the downplaying of events, such as the 1494 massacre, that contradicted this image of Poland as a safe haven for Jews. This Christian-centric approach to history writing contributed to the erasure of Jewish suffering from mainstream historical consciousness, leaving tragedies like the Krakow Massacre largely unexamined by non-Jewish historians. The marginalization of Jewish history in European scholarship. For centuries, Jewish history was considered a separate field of study, largely excluded from mainstream European history. Jewish scholars and historians recorded their own history, often focusing on internal Jewish struggles, religious debates, and cultural achievements rather than how they were treated by non-Jewish societies. As a result, many of the earliest Jewish historical accounts of massacres like Krakow's were written in Hebrew or Yiddish, making them inaccessible to non-Jewish historians who wrote the dominant historical narratives. European universities and scholars did not prioritize Jewish history in their curricula until the late 19th and 20th centuries, meaning events like the 1494 massacre were never fully integrated into general history textbooks. The field of Jewish history was often focused on broader themes, such as the Spanish Inquisition or the Holocaust, leaving smaller-scale massacres like Krakow's in relative obscurity. It was only in more recent decades, with the rise of Holocaust studies, Jewish historical scholarship, and increased interest in minority histories, that events like the Krakow Massacre of 1494 have begun to receive more attention from scholars. However, much work remains to be done in bringing this tragedy into mainstream historical discourse. The impact of later tragedies on collective memory. Another major reason why the Krakow Massacre has been forgotten is that later and larger Jewish tragedies overshadowed it. When we look at Jewish history, we see a long timeline of persecutions, expulsions, and massacres, each seemingly more devastating than the last. The Chmielnicki massacres, 1648 to 1657, a period of mass slaughter of Jews in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland and Ukraine, which resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands. The Russian pogroms, 19th and early 20th century, waves of violent attacks against Jewish communities in the Russian Empire. The Holocaust, 1941 to 1945, the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany. Compared to these monumental tragedies, the Krakow Massacre of 1494, though horrific, was smaller in scale, affecting hundreds or thousands rather than millions. As a result, historians and Jewish communities often focused on larger and more recent events, pushing smaller tragedies into the background. This phenomenon is known as hierarchies of suffering, when the most catastrophic events dominate historical memory, while smaller events, despite their significance, fade into obscurity. The 1494 massacre, as terrible as it was often overshadowed by these later, larger atrocities. The need for remembering the Krakow Massacre. Despite its historical obscurity, the Krakow Massacre of 1494 was a crucial event in Jewish history that deserves greater recognition. Its legacy is still visible in the long history of Jewish resilience, adaptation, and survival in Poland and beyond. By remembering and studying this massacre, we gain valuable insights into the patterns of anti-Semitic violence that shaped Jewish life in Europe for centuries, the psychological and cultural impacts of Jewish persecution, displacement, and forced relocation, the resilience of Jewish communities who rebuilt their lives in Kazimierz despite the trauma they endured, the role of historical silence in shaping our understanding of Jewish history, and the importance of preserving forgotten narratives. The lack of awareness about the Krakow Massacre of 1494 serves as a reminder of how history can be shaped by those who write it, and how easily the suffering of marginalized communities can be ignored or erased. By shedding light on this forgotten tragedy, we honor the memory of the victims and ensure that their stories are not lost to time. Remembering the Krakow Massacre of 1494. The Krakow Massacre of 1494 stands as a stark reminder of the vulnerability that Jewish communities faced throughout history. Though often overlooked, this tragedy was not just a moment of violence. It was a defining event that shaped the trajectory of Jewish life in Poland for centuries. It left behind deep scars, psychological, cultural, and historical, that influenced how Jews navigated their place in European society. By bringing this forgotten massacre to light, we acknowledge the suffering of the victims, the resilience of the survivors, and the historical patterns of persecution that continued for generations. More importantly, we recognize the dangers of historical silence. When tragedies like this are forgotten, we risk erasing the lessons they offer and diminishing the voices of those who endured them. Today, as we strive to understand the complex history of anti-Semitism, migration, and resilience, remembering the Krakow Massacre is more than just an act of historical justice. It is a commitment to ensuring that such violence and injustice are never repeated. The memory of those who suffered in 1494 must not fade into obscurity. Instead, it should serve as a powerful reminder that the past is not just history. It is a lesson for the future.